A mansion in Dubai, gleaming under the Arabian sun. Inside, a man stands in his home office, holding a gold-plated gun he's never fired before. His wife is on her knees, sobbing. His driver stands frozen in the doorway, and a baby sleeps peacefully in the nursery down the hall. In exactly 3 minutes, 2 shots will ring out. One person will die. One will survive but never walk again. And the man holding that gun? His life as he knows it will be over forever. But here's the question that haunts everyone who hears the story. Was this a crime of passion? Or was it cold-blooded murder? And more importantly, could you have seen it coming? Stay with me, because what unfolds in this mansion isn't just about betrayal. It's about what happens when money can buy everything except the one thing that matters most. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll be asking yourself, what would you have done? Let me take you back to where it all started. Back to 2010, when our main character was living a life most people only dream about. Or maybe, a life most people have nightmares about pretending is a dream. Meet Ghaffar, 25 years old in 2010, and living like every day is his last. And why wouldn't he? His father owns gold mines and oil fields. We're talking private jets, luxury cars that cost more than most people's houses, and a reputation that precedes him into every nightclub in Dubai. The young women of Dubai, they know his name, they know his face, they definitely know his bank account. And here's the thing, they don't even care that he's a playboy. In fact, that seems to make him more attractive. Funny how that works, isn't it? If you're rich enough, your red flags just look like regular flags. The young men, oh, they want to be him. They study his moves like he's teaching a masterclass in how to spend daddy's money with style. And Ghaffar? He's teaching that class with honors. Every single day is a party. Every night is a club. Every weekend is whatever he wants it to be. But let's be real here. Being the only son of a billionaire comes with some pretty heavy baggage. Sure, the private helicopters are nice. Yeah, having people know your name before you walk into a room feels good. But there's something else that comes with that territory: expectations. Ghafar's father didn't build an empire by partying. He built it by working, by making tough decisions, by sacrificing, and watching his only son, his heir, his legacy, spending money like it's going out of style. That's got to sting a little, or maybe a lot. But in 2013, something happened that nobody saw coming. Not his friends, not his father, and definitely not Ghaffar himself. There was an event at one of Dubai's fanciest hotels. The kind of place where the chandeliers cost more than luxury cars and the carpet is so plush you feel guilty walking on it. Ghaffar didn't want to be there. He was forced to attend, representing his father at some business function that required the family name but not necessarily the family patriarch. His father's chief of staff came along, probably to babysit, to make sure Ghaffar didn't embarrass the family name, to report back on whether the golden boy could handle something as simple as sitting through a business event without causing a scene. And then Ghaffar saw her, Eunice, 23 years old, Filipino, working as a hostess at the hotel. And according to everyone who was there that day, absolutely stunning. The kind of beautiful that makes you forget what you were doing. Which is exactly what happened to Ghaffar. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Eunice wasn't just another pretty face working a job in Dubai. She had a story, a real one, the kind that makes you remember that behind every person serving drinks or showing guests to their seats, there's an entire life you know nothing about. She'd been in Dubai for only 10 months. Back in the Philippines, her father worked as a farmer. Her mother was a trader. Eunice was the oldest of 5 children, which meant she wasn't just responsible for herself. She was responsible for helping her entire family. Her father had saved for 3 years. 3 years of farming to scrape together enough money to sponsor her trip to Dubai. Think about that for a second. 3 years of sunrise to sunset work, putting aside every spare coin, all so his daughter could have a chance at a better life. And Eunice? She wasn't wasting that chance. She'd worked as a hotelier in Manila, so she knew hospitality. She knew how to smile when she was tired, how to be gracious when guests were rude, how to make everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. She was humble, she was kind, and apparently, She was completely immune to Ghafar's charm. Because when this playboy, this man who'd never heard the word no from a woman in his entire adult life, walked up to her and asked for her information, asked her out on a date, tried to work his usual magic, she smiled politely and declined. Just like that. No hesitation. No apology. Just a simple, professional no thank you. Can you imagine Ghafar's face? This man who probably had women competing for his attention was just rejected by a hotel hostess. And not even rejected with drama or attitude. Just a smile and a no. The chief of staff probably noticed Ghafar's sudden lack of focus. Throughout the entire event, Ghaffar kept looking around, distracted, his mind clearly somewhere else. The chief of staff had to keep pulling him back to reality, reminding him why he was there, warning him that he'd have to report back to his father about this performance. Because here's the truth. Ghafar's father might love his son, but he wasn't about to hand over a business empire to someone who couldn't even sit through a meeting without getting distracted. But Ghaffar? He was already gone, already planning his next move, already thinking about that smile and that polite rejection. And that right there is where everything changed. For 2 days, Ghaffar searched. Not for a business opportunity. Not for the next party. For her. For the woman who'd said no. He didn't even know her name yet. All he had was a memory of her face and the knowledge that she worked for some hospitality agency. So he did what any obsessed person with unlimited resources would do. He started making calls. When he finally got through to the agency, he tried to describe her. But here's the problem. You can't just call up a company and say, hey, give me the personal information of one of your employees because I think she's pretty. That's not how this works. That's actually the opposite of how this works. The company rep on the phone was polite but firm. They couldn't give out employee information. Privacy policies, you understand. Unless there was misconduct to report. Unless something had gone wrong. And that's when Ghafar's playboy instincts kicked in. He lied. Smoothly, convincingly. He claimed that this hostess had been rude to him at the event 2 days ago. He was offended. He was hurt. He demanded an apology. From her. Directly. The company, probably terrified of losing a wealthy client, apologized immediately. They promised to get back to him within 24 hours with his requested apology. Took less than a day. Ghafar's phone rang, and a voice introduced herself as Eunice. That voice. He recognized it immediately, but he couldn't let her know that this was all a game, all a lie. So he pretended to be upset, pretended to consider her apology, and then made his move. What's your full name? Just so I know who I'm accepting an apology from. She told him, and just like that, Ghaffar had what he needed. Because with a full name and unlimited money, you can find anyone in Dubai. A few days later, he tracked her down to an apartment building. The kind of place where foreign workers live because it's affordable. Not luxury. Not fancy. Just practical housing for people sending most of their money back home to their families. Ghaffar showed up in one of his exotic cars. Because of course he did. He was going to impress her with wealth, with status, with everything that had worked on every other woman before her. But she wasn't home. She was at work. So he drove to the agency, only to discover she had the day off. He tried to get her phone number. Failed. Went home feeling, probably for the first time in his life, like he'd actually lost at something. That evening, he had to attend another event with his father. This time on Dubai's most exclusive island. They arrived by helicopter at 8:10 p.m. Because why take a car when you own a helicopter? They walked into the ballroom and there she was, Eunice, assigned to usher them to their seats. Assigned to escort his father, one of Dubai's wealthiest men, through the venue. Ghaffar heard her voice first. This way, sir. That's all it took. He looked up, recognized her instantly, and in that moment, completely forgot that his father was standing right there watching. After his father was seated, Ghaffar pulled Eunice aside. And this time, he didn't try to be smooth. He didn't try to impress her. He begged, literally begged for her phone number. He told her about his day, about searching for her, about going to her apartment and the agency. He apologized for lying to her company, for getting her in trouble. And maybe it was the honesty, Maybe it was seeing this wealthy playboy actually vulnerable for once. Maybe she just took pity on him. But Eunice gave him her number. That's when everything changed. Not just for Ghaffar but for everyone around him. His friends noticed it first. The guy who used to party 7 nights a week was suddenly canceling plans. The man who collected women like some people collect cars was suddenly focused on just one. He started showing up to family dinners. Started taking business calls seriously. Started acting, for the first time since anyone could remember, responsible. His father must have been shocked. Maybe even suspicious. Because people don't just change overnight, do they? Except sometimes they do. Sometimes all it takes is the right person to make you want to be better. For 14 months, they dated. 14 months of Ghaffar slowly transforming from playboy to boyfriend. From party animal to partner. And then he proposed. She said yes. Now, here's where the fairy tale should have had its happy ending. Young playboy reforms his ways. Falls in love with a kind woman from humble beginnings. They get married and live happily ever after. But this isn't a fairy tale. This is real life. And in real life, not everyone is happy when the playboy prince wants to marry the hotel hostess. Ghafar's father rejected the relationship immediately. He saw Eunice as beneath his son. Not worthy of the family name. Not suitable for someone who would one day inherit an empire. There had been suitable women, wealthy women from good families, paraded in front of Ghaffar for years. Women he'd rejected with the most ridiculous excuses. Too serious. Too ugly. Doesn't look right. And the most absurd one. This one's too serious. But now he wanted to marry a Filipino hotel worker? His father wasn't having it. Took Ghafar's mother getting involved. Took his friends pleading the case. It took time and patience and probably more than a few heated arguments. But eventually his father agreed. On one condition. Ghaffar had to take an important role in the company. He had to prove he was serious. Not just about Eunice but about his future, about the business, about being worthy of eventually taking over the empire. Ghaffar agreed. Because when you love someone, you'll do anything. Even become the person you've spent your whole life avoiding being. The wedding was small but elegant. And here's the beautiful part. Ghaffar flew Eunice's entire family from Manila to Dubai as a surprise. Her parents, who'd worked so hard to give her this opportunity. Her 4 siblings. All of them, first class, to watch their daughter and sister marry into one of Dubai's wealthiest families. Can you imagine what that must have felt like for them? The farmer who'd saved for 3 years to send his daughter away was now watching her marry someone who could spend that much money in an afternoon without noticing. For 3 days it was perfect. For 3 days Eunice was married to the man who'd changed his entire life for her. For 3 days, everything looked like it was going to work out. And then reality set in. 3 days after the wedding, Ghaffar started his new role in the company. He and Eunice traveled to London, and she thought this was their honeymoon. She probably imagined romantic dinners, walks through the city, long conversations without interruptions. What she got was 5 days of Ghaffar bouncing from one business meeting to another, from one appointment to the next, from one obligation to whatever came after that. Then they flew to Paris. The city of love, right? The most romantic place on earth. Except Ghaffar spent most of his time in conference rooms while Eunice explored the city with a hired driver and Ghafar's debit card. Go shopping, he told her. Buy whatever you want. As if expensive bags and jewelry could replace his presence. They returned to Dubai 4 days later, and it only got worse. Ghaffar became busier than ever. Dinners were missed. Date nights were cancelled. Intimate evenings ended with him falling asleep from exhaustion before anything could happen. And every time he messed up, every time he disappointed her, he bought something expensive. Diamond earrings for missing dinner. Designer bags for skipping date night. A luxury watch for falling asleep during what was supposed to be their time together. He was trying to buy her happiness. And maybe for a while she told herself it was fine. He was working hard. He was proving himself to his father. He was building their future. But here's what nobody talks about when they talk about marrying rich. Money can buy you everything except time. And time is the one thing you can't get back. After a year of marriage, Ghaffar made a decision. He hired a driver. Someone to take Eunice around the city while he was stuck in meetings. Someone to make sure she got to her appointments, her social gatherings, her attempts to build her own hospitality business. The driver's name was James, 30 years old, Filipino, and according to Gaffar's reasoning, this was perfect. James and Eunice were from the same village back home. They could talk in their native language. She'd feel more comfortable, less lonely. What Gaffar didn't know was that James had a very specific pattern. His roommate later testified about it. James had been touring the Middle East for years, working in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and now Dubai. And he had a rule. If he wasn't satisfied with his position after 3 years in a country, he moved on to the next one, always looking for the bigger score, the better opportunity, the perfect setup. When James got hired at the mansion, he was in his first year in Dubai. Still looking, still hunting for that big win. And then he was handed the keys to drive around a lonely, neglected young wife while her wealthy husband was too busy building an empire to notice what was happening in his own home. This is the part where you need to pay attention because this is where the cracks started showing. Not in loud, obvious ways, but in small moments that nobody noticed until it was too late. Eunice spent her days being driven around by James to elite social gatherings where she tried to fit into a world that still saw her as the hotel hostess who got lucky, to women's clubs where she smiled and made small talk with people who'd never had to work a day in their lives, to meetings for her own business, trying to build something of her own in a city where your worth is measured by your last name and your bank balance. James was there for all of it, waiting in the car, opening doors, making conversation, being present in a way her husband hadn't been in months. And here's the thing about loneliness. It makes you vulnerable. It makes you grateful for attention. It makes you mistake presence for connection and connection for something more. After months of this, Eunice and James became close. Too close. The kind of close that crosses lines that should never be crossed. The kind of close that happens when you're spending hours every day with someone while your spouse is spending hours every day away from you. 6 months into whatever this thing was between them, Eunice realized she'd made a massive mistake. She tried to end it. She tried to pull back, to create distance, to pretend like this could just stop and everything would go back to normal. But here's the problem with secrets. They don't stay secret, especially not in a mansion full of staff who see everything. The workers noticed. Of course they noticed. James sneaking into Eunice's room in the middle of the night when Gaffar was away on business trips. You can't do that in a house full of people and expect nobody to see. You can't be that careless and think there won't be consequences. The gossip started spreading among the staff. Whispers in the laundry room. Knowing looks exchanged in hallways. Everyone knew. Everyone except the one person who needed to know. A few weeks after Eunice ended things with James, she discovered something that changed everything. She was pregnant. Stop and think about this for a second. Put yourself in Eunice's position. You're pregnant. You've been sleeping with your husband, but you've also been sleeping with someone else. And you have absolutely no idea who the father is. What do? Eunice made a choice. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was denial. Maybe it was just easier to believe what she wanted to believe. She decided the baby was Gaffar's. She had to be Gaffar's. Because if it wasn't, her entire life, her family's future, everything she'd built, it would all collapse. When she told Gaffar she was pregnant, he was thrilled. This man who'd spent years avoiding responsibility was suddenly ready to be a father. He started reducing his business trips. He stayed home more. He took care of his pregnant wife the way he should have been taking care of her all along. Because that's what Gaffar did, right? He fixed his mistakes by going all in. When he messed up, he didn't do half measures. He transformed himself for Eunice once before, and now he was doing it again for their child. And maybe this was his redemption. Maybe this was his chance to prove to his father that he really had changed. That he could manage the business empire and be a good husband and father. That the playboy was really, truly gone. The baby was born a few months later. A boy. A young millionaire prince, as everyone called him. The heir to the heir. The next generation of the family dynasty. Gaffar held his son and felt everything a new father feels. Joy, pride, fear. love. But there was something else too. Something he couldn't quite name. A nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Why does the baby look so much like his mother? Why doesn't he see any of himself in this child? But he pushed it aside. Babies change. Babies grow into their features. This was his son. Had to be his son. With the baby at home, Ghaffar decided he needed a home office. Somewhere he could work when he wasn't traveling so he could be present for his family while still managing business. He chose a bedroom and renovated it completely. Professional office setup, separate toilet, the works. The toilet ended up being positioned directly above the laundry room. And that architectural detail? That's what changed everything. One day, Ghaffar was in his office bathroom, doing what people do in bathrooms. And through the floor, through the pipes, through whatever gap existed between rooms, he heard voices. The staff in the laundry room below, talking while they worked. And they were gossiping about his son, about how the baby looked exactly like James, about how everyone believed James might be the real father, about how obvious it was to everyone except Ghaffar himself. Have you ever had that moment where something you didn't want to believe suddenly makes perfect sense? Where all the little pieces you'd been ignoring suddenly form a picture you can't unsee? That's what happened to Ghaffar in that moment. Sitting in his bathroom, listening to his staff gossip about whether his son was actually his son. Everything he'd been pushing aside, everything he'd been telling himself didn't matter, suddenly mattered very much. He started watching, paying attention, comparing the baby to James in ways he'd never done before, looking for similarities, looking for proof, looking for anything that would either confirm or deny what he'd heard. But looking wasn't enough. Wondering wasn't enough. He needed to know, really know. So he did what anyone with money and access would do. He arranged for a DNA test, secretly, without telling anyone. Just him and the medical facility, and the results that would either put his mind at ease or destroy his entire world. He waited for days. Days of pretending everything was normal. Days of holding his son and wondering. Days of looking at his wife and trying to see if there was guilt in her eyes. And then the results came back. He was not the father. James was the biological father of the child. Think about what that means. For over a year, Ghaffar had been raising another man's child. A child conceived while he was out building a future for his family. A child that represented his legacy, his redemption, his proof that he'd changed. All of it was a lie. For days, he tried to compose himself, tried to figure out what to do, tried to process the fact that his wife and his driver had betrayed him in the worst possible way, that everyone in his house knew or suspected or gossiped about it, that he'd been the fool, the joke, the man too busy working to notice what was happening in his own bedroom. Finally, he decided to confront them. He called Eunice into his home office. That office he'd built so he could be closer to his family. That office with the bathroom where he'd first heard the truth. He told her what he'd discovered, and Eunice broke down, tears streaming down her face, falling to her knees, begging. Whether she was begging for forgiveness or just begging him not to destroy her life, we'll never know. Ghaffar demanded explanations. He asked her if the love he'd shown wasn't enough, if the lifestyle he'd provided wasn't enough. If changing his entire existence for her wasn't enough, what more could he have possibly given her? And while Eunice was on her knees sobbing, James walked into the home office. Picture this scene. Eunice on her knees, sobbing, begging. Ghaffar standing over her, holding DNA results that proved his son wasn't his son. And James walking through the door, completely unaware of what he was walking into. It took James maybe 5 seconds to understand the situation, to realize that Ghaffar knew about the affair. But here's what James didn't know yet. Ghaffar knew about the baby, about the paternity, about the fact that James had fathered the child that Ghaffar had been raising as his heir. When Ghaffar told him, when those words came out, "Look, arrangements can be made," James's brain must have gone into overdrive. What does he do? How does he handle this? And this is where James made the worst decision of his entire life. He looked at Ghaffar, this wealthy man who just discovered his world was built on lies, and he said, Just give me $2 million and I'll keep my mouth shut. You can claim the child as yours. Rewind that again. Really let it sink in. James just tried to blackmail Ghaffar. In Ghafar's own house. After sleeping with his wife. After fathering his child. James thought this was a negotiation. A business deal. Give me money and this all goes away. It was said sarcastically. Like a threat wrapped in a joke. Like, you don't pay me, I'll tell the press. I'll tell your father. I'll tell everyone that the great Ghaffar, the reformed playboy, the heir to the empire, is raising another man's child. For days, Ghaffar had been trying to control his anger, trying to process the betrayal, trying to figure out how to handle this situation with some semblance of dignity. But hearing those words, hearing this trash talk from the mouth of the man who'd destroyed his marriage, something inside him snapped. On his desk was an antique box. Inside that box was a gold-plated gun he'd received as a gift in Mexico after closing a business deal. The gun was loaded. It had never been fired. It was decorative. A trophy. A symbol of wealth and success. But that day it became something else entirely. Without thinking, without planning, without any of the careful consideration he'd been trained to use in business, Ghaffar pulled out the gun. One shot. Straight through the middle of James's forehead. James dropped. Just like that. The man who'd been asking for $2 million was dead before he hit the floor. The man who thought this was a negotiation had no idea he was gambling with his life. Eunice screamed, or was about to scream, but then she looked up and saw Ghafar's eyes. Red, emotionless, angry, and she knew in that instant that she was next. She ran, or tried to run. Her survival instincts kicked in and she bolted for the door. But Ghaffar fired 3 times. The first shot hit the wall. The second and third shots hit Eunice in the middle of her back as she was trying to escape. She fell, collapsed, her spine shattered by bullets from a gold-plated gun that was supposed to be a decoration. The staff heard everything. The shots echoed through the mansion. People came running, screaming, trying to understand what had just happened. And they saw Ghaffar walking toward the nursery, walking toward the baby's room, still holding the gun. What was he going to do? Was he going to kill the child too? Was he so consumed by rage that he was willing to murder an innocent baby just because that baby wasn't biologically his? We'll never know, because before Ghaffar reached the nursery, the police stormed into the mansion and arrested him. Later, in court, Ghaffar would say something that haunted everyone who heard it. His only regret, he claimed, was that he'd used his precious gold gun to shoot their worthless lives. Not that he'd killed someone. Not that he'd nearly killed his wife. Not that he'd traumatized his staff and destroyed multiple families. His regret was about the gun. Eunice survived. But survival isn't the same as living. The bullets damaged her spine so severely that she would never walk again. The woman who'd traveled from the Philippines to Dubai to build a better life was now confined to a wheelchair, facing questions about her role in a murder case. The baby, innocent in all of this, became the center of a legal nightmare. Who has custody of a child whose biological father is dead and whose legal father is in prison for murder? Eunice's family back in the Philippines had to process what happened. Their daughter, who was supposed to be living a fairy tale life in Dubai, was now paralyzed and testifying in a murder trial. The farmer who'd saved for 3 years to send her to Dubai had to watch his daughter's life fall apart from thousands of miles away. Ghafar's father, the billionaire who'd reluctantly accepted his son's marriage, now had to face the fact that his heir, the son he'd given a second chance, had committed murder. All the work they'd done together, all the progress Ghaffar had made in the business, all the proof that he'd changed, it was all meaningless now. The staff who'd gossiped in the laundry room had to live with the knowledge that their words, overheard through a bathroom floor, had triggered a chain of events that led to murder. Would Ghaffar have ordered that DNA test if he hadn't heard them talking? Would he have confronted Eunice and James if he hadn't known that everyone knew his secret? James's roommate, the one who'd talked about James's pattern of moving from country to country looking for the big score, had to wonder, is this what James meant by a big win? Sleeping with a wealthy man's wife? Fathering his child? Trying to blackmail him for $2 million? And was it worth his life? The trial became a media sensation. How could it not? A wealthy playboy turned family man murders his wife's lover in his own home. A gold-plated gun used in a crime of passion. A baby caught in the middle of a love triangle that ended in violence. The defense argued it was a crime of passion. That Ghaffar had been provoked beyond what any reasonable person could endure. That discovering your wife's infidelity, your child's paternity, and then being blackmailed by your wife's lover would drive anyone to temporary insanity. The prosecution argued it was calculated murder. That Ghaffar had days to process the DNA results before confronting anyone. That he'd chosen to keep a loaded gun in his office. That he'd fired 3 times at his wife, not once, showing intent to kill, not just rage. What do you think? Was this temporary insanity or cold-blooded murder? Because here's the thing, both arguments have merit. Both sides have points that make sense. If you discovered your entire life was built on a lie, how would you react? If the child you thought was yours turned out to be someone else's, could you remain calm? If the person who'd betrayed you then tried to blackmail you, what would you do? But also, Ghaffar had days to think, days to plan, days to decide how to handle this. He could have divorced Eunice. He could have fired James. He could have taken the baby and walked away. He had money, power, resources. He had options that most people in his situation would never have. Instead, he chose violence. He chose to end a life and nearly end another. He chose to traumatize everyone in his household, including the baby he'd raised for months. The court had to weigh all of this. They had to look at a man who genuinely changed his life for love, only to discover that love was built on betrayal. They had to consider whether his actions were justified by his pain or inexcusable despite it. In the end, the verdict came down to one question. At what point does understanding someone's pain excuse their actions? At what point do we say, yes, you were hurt, yes, you were betrayed, but that doesn't give you the right to kill? Ghaffar was sentenced to prison. The exact terms don't matter as much as what they represent. Society saying that no matter how much you're hurt, no matter how deeply you're betrayed, murder is not the answer. Your pain does not justify taking a life. But here's what keeps people up at night about this case. What would you have done? Not what you think you should do, not what's legally or morally right, but what would you actually do in that moment? When everything you thought was true turns out to be false. When the person you changed your entire life for betrayed you. When the child you thought was your legacy isn't yours. When the man responsible tries to blackmail you instead of apologizing. In that moment, with a loaded gun within reach, what would you have done? Eunice lives with her decision every day. She can't walk. She can't escape the consequences of her actions. She chose to betray her husband, and while that doesn't justify what happened to her, it certainly led to it. James doesn't have to live with anything. His decision to ask for money instead of mercy cost him his life. His attempt to turn a tragedy into a transaction ended in his death. Ghaffar lives in a cell, possibly for the rest of his life, with the knowledge that he murdered a man and nearly killed his wife. That his son will grow up knowing his legal father tried to kill his biological father and his mother. That everything he built, everything he worked for, was destroyed in the time it took to fire 4 shots. And the baby? That child will grow up with the most complicated origin story imaginable. His biological father was murdered by his legal father for having an affair with his mother. His mother is paralyzed because his legal father shot her. His entire existence sparked a tragedy that destroyed 3 families. So what do we take away from this? What's the lesson here? Maybe it's that money can't buy happiness. That's obvious enough. Ghaffar had everything and it meant nothing when his marriage fell apart. Maybe it's that betrayal has consequences. Eunice and James made choices that led directly to their fates. Their actions set everything in motion. Maybe it's that people don't really change. That the playboy was always there under the surface, and it just took the right trigger to bring him back out. Or maybe the real lesson is simpler. We're all one bad moment away from destroying our lives. We're all capable of actions we never thought we'd take when pushed far enough. We all have a breaking point. Ghaffar thought he'd left his old life behind. He thought he'd become someone better. And maybe he had. But when everything collapsed, when he was pushed to his absolute limit, He didn't respond with the measured wisdom of a changed man. He responded with violence. That's the story. That's what happened when a playboy fell in love, built a new life, and then watched it all turn out to be a lie. The gold gun that was supposed to be a trophy ended 2 lives that day. And the man who pulled the trigger? He lost his life too, just in a different way. What would you have done?